Picture this. It's the spring of 52 BC, and the most brilliant military mind in human history is standing at the base of a seemingly impossible mountain fortress. Julius Caesar, the man who conquered nations, who crossed the Rubicon, who would one day become emperor of Rome, is staring up at walls that seem to mock his very existence. But here's what's absolutely incredible. This isn't just any fortress. This is Gergovia, and what happened here would shatter Caesar's reputation of invincibility forever. You're probably thinking, how could the greatest general who ever lived face his most crushing defeat? How could a man who never lost a campaign suddenly find himself completely, utterly outmaneuvered? But what happened next would change the course of human history forever. Here's what you need to understand about Gaul in 52 BC. This wasn't just another Roman conquest. This was personal. This was about pride, power, and the very soul of two civilizations locked in a death struggle that would echo through the centuries. For 6 long years, Caesar had been systematically dismantling Gallic resistance, village by village, tribe by tribe, with the cold, methodical precision of a master craftsman. His legions had become legends themselves, disciplined killing machines that moved across the landscape like unstoppable forces of nature. But here's where things get fascinating. The Gauls weren't just barbarians waiting to be conquered. They were a sophisticated people with their own complex political systems, their own military traditions, and most importantly, their own burning desire for freedom. Now you might be wondering, what sparked this final desperate rebellion? The answer lies in the character of one man, Vercingetorix. Picture, if you will, a Gallic chieftain in his early 30s. Tall, commanding, with the kind of natural charisma that could unite warring tribes under a single banner. He wasn't just another local warlord. This man was Caesar's intellectual equal. A strategic genius who understood something that no Gallic leader before him had grasped. The Romans could be beaten. Caesar, meanwhile, was dealing with pressures that would have crushed a lesser man. Back in Rome, his political enemies were circling like vultures. Pompey and Crassus, his former allies in the first triumvirate, were growing suspicious of his growing power and influence. Every day he spent in Gaul was another day his rivals could plot against him. And then came the winter of 53–52 BC, the worst in living memory. Snow piled higher than a man's head across the Alpine passes. The wind howled like the voices of angry gods. It was during this brutal season that something extraordinary happened. The Gauls began to whisper. In smoky longhouses and around flickering campfires, the message spread from tribe to tribe. Now was the time. While Caesar's legions were scattered in winter quarters, isolated and vulnerable, the moment had come to strike back against the invaders who had brought nothing but death and slavery to their lands. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because what's about to unfold is even more incredible than a simple rebellion. This was a coordinated uprising that would test every ounce of Caesar's legendary genius. The first sign of trouble came in the depths of winter. A Roman merchant caravan, peaceful traders who had been crossing Gallic territory for years, was found slaughtered on the frozen roads near Cenabum. Every man, woman, and child, butchered without mercy. When the news reached Caesar's winter headquarters, his reaction was swift and terrible. Within days, Roman legions were marching through knee-deep snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, their hobnailed boots crunching across frozen streams. Cenabum burned. The message was clear: cross Rome and face annihilation. But this time the message fell on deaf ears. Because for the first time in 6 years, the Gauls had found something more powerful than fear of Roman vengeance. They had found hope, and that hope had a name: Vercingetorix. Here's what's absolutely astonishing about this moment in history. Vercingetorix didn't just unite the Gallic tribes through inspiring speeches and promises of glory. He did something far more sophisticated. He developed a military strategy that turned Caesar's greatest strengths into weaknesses. You see, Roman legions were incredibly effective in open battle. Their discipline, their training, their superior equipment. In a head-to-head fight, they were virtually unbeatable. But Vercingetorix understood that he didn't need to beat the Romans in open battle. He just needed to avoid losing until Caesar ran out of time, supplies, and political support back home. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The Gallic leader implemented what military historians now call a scorched earth strategy. As Roman legions approached, Gallic warriors would melt away into the forests and hills. But first, they would burn everything. Crops, granaries, villages, anything that could sustain an invading army went up in flames. Caesar found himself chasing ghosts through a wasteland of his enemy's own making, and that's when the attacks began. Not massive battles, but pinprick raids that slowly bled the legions white. A supply train ambushed at dawn, a foraging party that never returned home. Roman soldiers began to glance nervously at every tree line, wondering if death was watching them from the shadows. The stage was set, but no one could have predicted what was coming. Trouble was brewing across every corner of Gaul, and Caesar could feel the very ground shifting beneath his feet. It started with whispers in the marketplaces of Roman allied towns. Merchants who had grown wealthy trading with the legions suddenly found their warehouses mysteriously catching fire in the night. Local chieftains who had sworn loyalty to Rome began receiving cryptic messages, reminders of old debts, old loyalties, old promises. You can imagine how Caesar must have felt when the reports started flooding in. This wasn't random violence. This was coordination on a scale that defied everything he thought he knew about Gallic capabilities. The first major shock came from an unexpected source. The Aedui, Rome's most trusted allies in Gaul for over half a century, suddenly and inexplicably switched sides. These weren't wild barbarians driven by emotion. These were sophisticated politicians who had carefully calculated that Caesar's time was coming to an end. When that news reached Caesar's headquarters, witnesses reported that the great general stood in complete silence for nearly an hour, just staring at the dispatch. His staff officers didn't dare speak. The man who had conquered nations was realizing that his greatest challenge wasn't going to be a military one. It was going to be political. But here's where Caesar's genius truly shined. Instead of panicking, instead of rushing blindly forward or retreating to lick his wounds, he did something absolutely extraordinary. He analyzed the situation with the cold precision of a master strategist and identified the one thing that could turn this rebellion from a dangerous nuisance into an existential threat. Vercingetorix needed a symbol, a victory so complete, so undeniable that every fence-sitting tribe across Gaul would join the rebellion. And Caesar was going to make sure that symbol was never created. The Roman general's solution was characteristically audacious. If Vercingetorix wanted to play the game of maneuver and attrition, Caesar would force him into exactly the kind of fight the Gallic leader was trying to avoid: a siege. Now here's the thing. Caesar was absolutely masterful at siege warfare. His engineers could build fortifications that would make modern military planners weep with envy. His logistical systems could keep massive armies supplied in the middle of hostile territory for months on end. And his psychological understanding of how sieges worked, how they broke the will of defenders, was second to none. So when Caesar's scouts reported that Vercingetorix had taken position in the hilltop fortress of Gergovia, the Roman reaction was almost gleeful. Finally, a target they couldn't run from. But get this, Vercingetorix wasn't making a desperate last stand. He was laying a trap that had been months in the making, and Caesar, brilliant, experienced, seemingly invincible Caesar, was walking straight into it. Gergovia wasn't just any fortress. This was the ancestral stronghold of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix's own people. Built on a volcanic plateau that rose nearly 1,000 feet above the surrounding countryside, its walls seemed to grow directly from the living rock itself. More importantly, it was surrounded by a network of smaller forts and watchtowers that controlled every approach for miles around. Taking Gergovia wouldn't just require defeating its garrison. It would mean conquering an entire defensive system that had been perfected over generations. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Caesar's first probe of the defenses was educational. His advanced scouts reported that the approaches to the fortress were far more challenging than initial intelligence had suggested. The slopes weren't just steep. They were covered with obstacles that channeled any attacking force into killing zones where Gallic archers and slingers could rain death from above with impunity. But Caesar had faced impossible fortresses before. Alesia would later prove that no Gallic stronghold was truly impregnable when Roman engineering was properly applied. So he ordered his legions to begin the methodical process of siege preparation. What happened next reveals something absolutely crucial about the nature of this conflict. As Roman engineers began surveying approaches and construction sites for their siege works, Gallic war parties started appearing on the surrounding hills. Not attacking, just watching. Hundreds of warriors, then thousands, gathering like storm clouds on every horizon. Caesar found himself in a position that was entirely new to his experience. He was besieging a fortress while being observed by an enemy army that outnumbered his own forces by potentially 3 or 4 to 1. Here's what's fascinating about Caesar's psychology at this moment. According to his own writings, he wasn't intimidated. If anything, he was excited. This was exactly the kind of challenge that had made him famous. The impossible situation that lesser generals would flee from was precisely the scenario where Caesar's genius shined brightest. But Vercingetorix had spent 6 years studying Caesar's methods. He knew that the Roman general's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. Caesar couldn't resist a challenge. The more impossible the odds seemed, the more determined Caesar became to prove that Roman discipline and engineering could overcome any obstacle. So Vercingetorix gave him exactly the kind of challenge that Caesar couldn't walk away from. Each decision brought them closer to the inevitable. You're probably wondering at this point, how could two such brilliant military minds find themselves locked in a confrontation where both sides seemed convinced they held the advantage? The answer lies in understanding something that military historians call the fog of war. Neither commander could see the complete picture. Caesar knew his own strengths, but could only guess at Gallic capabilities. Vercingetorix understood his own strategic position but had never faced Roman siege warfare at its most sophisticated level. Both men were operating with incomplete information, making calculated risks based on their own experience and intelligence. And both were about to discover just how costly those calculations could be. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Pompey was planning something devastating. But we'll get to that. The moment of truth had arrived. Caesar is standing at the base of Gergovia, in the early morning mist of late spring 52 BC. You could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. 40,000 Roman legionnaires are spread across the valley below the fortress, their scarlet cloaks and polished armor creating a sea of disciplined military might. But look up, just look up at those walls. Gergovia isn't just built on a hill. It's carved from the living mountain itself. The fortress walls rise directly from cliffs that plunge hundreds of feet to the valley floor. Even from a distance, you can see Gallic warriors moving along the battlements like ants, their spear points glinting in the morning sun. Caesar's first move was absolutely textbook Roman siege warfare. While his main force established a fortified camp in the valley, advanced engineering units began the methodical process of reconnaissance and planning. Every approach was mapped, every weakness cataloged, every angle of attack calculated with mathematical precision. Here's what you need to understand about Roman military engineering. These weren't just soldiers with shovels. Roman engineers were the most sophisticated military construction specialists the world had ever seen. They could build roads across impassable swamps, throw bridges across raging rivers, and create siege works that turned impossible attacks into methodical conquests. But Gergovia presented challenges that pushed even Roman capabilities to their limits. The volcanic rock that formed the plateau was incredibly hard, nearly impervious to picks and shovels. The slopes leading to the fortress were not only steep, but covered with loose stones that would avalanche at the slightest disturbance, potentially burying attacking troops in tons of rocky debris. Most challenging of all, the fortress had been built with multiple defensive lines. Even if Roman forces somehow managed to breach the outer walls, they would face a series of increasingly formidable obstacles as they fought their way up toward the citadel at the summit. Caesar's solution was characteristically innovative. If he couldn't take Gergovia by direct assault, he would force the defenders to come out and fight on terms more favorable to Roman tactics. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Roman forces would construct a series of fortified positions that gradually constricted the area around Gergovia like a tightening noose. Eventually, the fortress would be completely cut off from outside supplies and reinforcement. Faced with the choice between starvation and battle, Vercingetorix would have to abandon his defensive advantages. But here's where the first cracks in Caesar's strategy began to show. Construction of the Roman siege works proceeded far more slowly than anticipated. The rocky terrain that made Gergovia nearly impregnable also made it incredibly difficult to dig trenches and build fortifications. Work parties that should have completed their tasks in days found themselves struggling for weeks to make meaningful progress. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening on the surrounding hills. Gallic reinforcements weren't just trickling in. They were arriving in massive waves. Warrior bands from tribes that had never cooperated before were joining forces under Vercingetorix's banner. Druids, the spiritual leaders who had traditionally opposed any kind of unified Gallic resistance, were openly supporting the rebellion. You can imagine how Caesar must have felt watching those numbers grow. Each morning brought reports of new camps, new banners, new thousands of enemy warriors gathering just beyond Roman reach. But the real psychological pressure was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. For 6 years, Caesar's legions had been accustomed to Gallic forces that would fight fiercely but ultimately break when faced with disciplined Roman tactics. These warriors were different. They moved with a confidence and coordination that spoke of professional military leadership. They established their own defensive positions with skill that rivaled Roman engineering. Most unnervingly, they showed absolutely no fear of Roman power. Caesar decided that the time had come for a demonstration of what Roman military might could accomplish. If Vercingetorix wanted to inspire his followers with defiance, Caesar would show them exactly what defying Rome meant. The target was a fortified Gallic camp on a hill called Risoles, positioned about 2 miles from Gergovia. Intelligence reports indicated that the position was held by approximately 3,000 warriors. A significant force, but nothing that 2 experienced Roman legions couldn't handle with proper planning and execution. The attack was launched just before dawn on what Roman records indicate was a perfectly clear morning. Caesar himself led the assault, riding at the front of his cavalry as infantry columns moved into position on both flanks. Here's what absolutely incredible about what happened next. The assault began exactly as planned. Roman forces advanced under cover of darkness, achieved complete tactical surprise, and overwhelmed the outer defensive positions before the Gallic defenders could organize an effective response. Within hours, Caesar's legions had captured the entire fortified camp and inflicted devastating casualties on its garrison. It should have been a perfect demonstration of Roman superiority, a clear message to every Gallic warrior watching from the surrounding hills that resistance was futile. Instead, it became the beginning of Caesar's worst nightmare. You see, the capture of the camp at Rissoles had an effect that was completely opposite to what Caesar had intended. Rather than intimidating the Gallic forces, it enraged them. Rather than demonstrating Roman invincibility, it proved that Roman forces could be drawn out of their prepared positions and engaged on more equal terms. Most dangerously of all, it gave Vercingetorix exactly what he had been waiting for: an opportunity to demonstrate his own tactical brilliance. As Caesar's forces were consolidating their positions around the captured camp, Gallic war parties began appearing on every hill within sight. Not attacking, not even approaching within missile range, just watching. Thousands and thousands of silent, motionless warriors. The psychological effect on the Roman legions was immediate and profound. These weren't the disorganized barbarian hordes they had fought for 6 years. This was an army that moved and positioned itself with a discipline that matched their own. And then came the moment that changed everything. A single Gallic war horn echoed across the valley. Deep, mournful, like the voice of the mountain itself. Then another. Then dozens, then hundreds, until the very air vibrated with their haunting call. As the sound died away, something absolutely extraordinary happened. The entire Gallic army, tens of thousands of warriors spread across miles of terrain, began moving in perfect coordination toward predetermined positions. Caesar realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, that he wasn't facing a collection of tribal war bands led by an ambitious chieftain. He was facing a professional army commanded by a military genius who had been planning this confrontation for months. But the real test was yet to come. You know what? If you're as fascinated by this incredible story as I am, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us bring more of these untold stories of empires, battles, and human drama to life. Trust me, the best part is still coming. We're about to witness one of the most shocking military reversals in all of ancient history. A moment when the greatest general who ever lived came face to face with his own limitations. A battle that would reshape not just the Roman conquest of Gaul, but the entire future of Western civilization. Now, where were we? Oh, right. The moment that would change everything. Things were about to get much, much worse for Caesar and his legions. What happened over the next 3 days would test every assumption Caesar had made about Gallic military capabilities. It started with something that seemed almost trivial: Roman foraging parties. The small groups of soldiers responsible for gathering food and supplies from the surrounding countryside began disappearing. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just failing to return to camp at the appointed times. Search parties sent to find the missing foragers would discover the scattered remains of what had obviously been swift, brutal ambushes. Professional work. No survivors, no witnesses, no clues about where the attackers had come from or where they had gone. Within a week, Caesar found himself facing a logistical crisis that threatened to undermine his entire campaign. Here's what's absolutely crucial to understand about Roman military operations. The legions were incredibly effective fighting machines, but they were also enormous consumers of supplies. 40,000 men required thousands of pounds of grain, olive oil, wine, and other provisions every single day. Under normal circumstances, Roman logistical systems were more than capable of meeting these needs. But Gergovia wasn't normal circumstances. The scorched earth tactics that Vercingetorix had implemented across the region meant that there was virtually nothing available for foraging within a day's march of the Roman camps. Everything that could feed an army had been systematically destroyed months earlier. That meant Caesar's forces were entirely dependent on supply convoys, traveling hundreds of miles through increasingly hostile territory. And those convoys were exactly what Vercingetorix had been waiting to target. The first major attack came at dawn on a misty morning in late April. A Roman supply train carrying nearly a month's worth of provisions was ambushed in a narrow valley about 15 miles from Gergovia. The convoy's military escort, Two full cohorts of experienced legionnaires fought with desperate courage but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. When the survivors limped back to Caesar's camp with news of the disaster, they brought reports that chilled even veteran centurions to the bone. The Gallic attack hadn't been a wild charge by undisciplined barbarians. It had been a carefully orchestrated military operation that demonstrated tactical sophistication equal to anything in Roman doctrine. Multiple coordinated assaults from different directions. Disciplined use of terrain to neutralize Roman advantages in armor and training. Most ominously, evidence of detailed intelligence about Roman movements and schedules. Caesar was facing an enemy that could think, plan, and adapt as effectively as he could. But here's where Caesar's legendary determination began working against him. Any other general might have recognized that the strategic situation had fundamentally changed and adjusted his plans accordingly. Caesar saw the attacks on his supply lines as a challenge to his professional competence that demanded an immediate and decisive response. He decided to take personal command of the next supply convoy. Now this is where things get absolutely insane. Caesar assembled a force that included not just the supply wagons and their normal escort, but 3 full legions of his finest troops. Nearly 15,000 men supported by cavalry and auxiliary units. It was a military force powerful enough to conquer most cities, all dedicated to protecting a few dozen wagons of grain and olive oil. The psychological message was unmistakable. Attack Roman supplies and face the full might of Caesar's vengeance. Vercingetorix's response was to give Caesar exactly what he wanted: a battle. But on Gallic terms, in terrain of Gallic choosing, at a time when Gallic forces held every possible advantage. The ambush site was a masterpiece of military engineering disguised as natural terrain. A valley that appeared to offer safe passage for the Roman column was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Hidden archer positions commanded every approach. Prepared obstacles would channel Roman forces into predetermined zones where Gallic superiority in numbers could be brought to bear most effectively. Most brilliantly, Vercingetorix had positioned his forces so that any Roman attempt to fight their way out of the ambush would drive them further from their base at Gergovia, deeper into territory where Gallic forces could bring overwhelming numbers to bear. Caesar walked straight into it. The attack began just after midday, when the Roman column was strung out along nearly 2 miles of narrow valley floor. The first sign of trouble was a rain of arrows and slingstones that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Roman shields came up in the disciplined testudo formation that had protected legions in 100 battles. But the missile fire was coming from too many directions to fully deflect, and then came the war cries. Thousands of Gallic warriors emerged from concealment on both sides of the valley, their painted faces twisted with battle fury, their long swords and spears glinting in the afternoon sun. The sound of their charge was like thunder rolling off the mountain walls. But here's what's absolutely extraordinary about Caesar's reaction. Even caught in what was obviously a carefully planned trap, even facing odds that would have terrified most commanders, Caesar didn't panic. He didn't retreat. He didn't even consider the possibility of defeat. Instead, he did what he had always done when faced with impossible odds. He attacked. Caesar's countercharge was a thing of terrible beauty. Roman legions that had been caught off guard and spread thin across miles of terrain somehow managed to reorganize themselves into battle formation and launch coordinated assaults on both flanks simultaneously. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Hand-to-hand combat in terrain that favored neither side, where individual courage and skill mattered more than tactical sophistication or numerical advantage. Roman discipline and training against Gallic fury and desperation. For nearly 4 hours, the battle raged without either side gaining a decisive advantage. Roman legionnaires advanced step by bloody step up slopes defended by warriors who preferred death to retreat. Gallic charges crashed again and again against Roman shield walls that bent but never broke. And then, just as it seemed that Roman discipline might once again prove superior to Gallic numbers, Vercingetorix played his final card. Fresh Gallic reinforcements, thousands of warriors who had been held in reserve specifically for this moment, swept down from the surrounding hills like an avalanche. Not tired troops who had been fighting all day, but fresh warriors whose only job was to finish what their comrades had started. The Roman lines wavered. For the first time in 6 years of Gallic campaigning, Caesar's legions began to give ground. What happened next would be remembered as long as men told stories of war and courage. Caesar himself, recognizing that his entire army was on the verge of destruction, grabbed a shield and sword and charged directly into the thickest part of the fighting. Not directing the battle from a safe distance, not sending subordinates to rally the troops. The proconsul of Rome, the conqueror of Gaul, fighting hand-to-hand like a common legionnaire. The sight of their general wading into battle with his own sword had an electrifying effect on the Roman forces. Centurions who had been preparing to sound retreat instead ordered their men to advance. Legionnaires who had been slowly giving ground suddenly found new strength and determination. But it wasn't enough. The Gallic numerical advantage was simply too overwhelming. Despite heroic efforts by individual units and extraordinary personal courage by Caesar himself, the Roman column was being systematically destroyed piece by piece. Caesar made the most painful decision of his military career. He ordered a withdrawal, not a strategic redeployment, not a tactical adjustment, a retreat, the first of his entire career. Under cover of a desperate rearguard action led by Caesar's most veteran troops, the remnants of the Roman force fought their way out of the valley and began the long, humiliating march back to Gergovia. But the worst part, this was only the beginning of Caesar's troubles. This is it, the moment we've been building to. Caesar is back at his camp below Gergovia. And for the first time in his legendary career, he's tasting the bitter ashes of defeat. His supply situation is desperate. His troops are demoralized. And most dangerously of all, word of his setbacks is spreading across Gaul like wildfire. Every day brought new reports of tribes declaring for Vercingetorix. The Aedui, Rome's oldest and most reliable allies in the region, had not only switched sides but were actively recruiting other tribes to join the rebellion. Even worse, intelligence reports indicated that Gallic emissaries were making contact with Germanic tribes across the Rhine, promising rich rewards for anyone willing to attack Roman territories. The political implications were staggering. If Caesar's Gallic command collapsed, his enemies in Rome would move against him immediately. Pompey, Cato, Cicero, all the senators who had spent years waiting for an opportunity to destroy Caesar politically, would have the perfect justification for bringing him back to Rome in chains. But here's what separates great generals from merely good ones. Caesar's response to this crisis wasn't despair or panic. It was cold, calculating analysis of exactly what needed to be done to turn disaster into victory. Caesar understood something that his enemies had forgotten. Military setbacks, no matter how serious, were temporary problems that could be solved by superior strategy and determination. Political destruction, on the other hand, was permanent, which meant that failure was not an option. Caesar's first move was to address the morale crisis within his own ranks. Roman legions had followed him through 6 years of continuous victory. They had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as invincible. The defeat in the valley and the subsequent retreat had shaken their confidence in ways that went far deeper than simple tactical setbacks. So Caesar did something absolutely extraordinary. He called a general assembly of all his forces, not just the officers, but every single legionnaire in his army. 40,000 men gathered in the valley below Gergovia to hear what their commander had to say about their situation. What happened next reveals everything about Caesar's understanding of military psychology. Instead of making excuses or minimizing the seriousness of their defeat, Caesar acknowledged exactly what had happened. Yes, they had been outmaneuvered. Yes, they had been forced to retreat. Yes, the Gallic forces opposing them were more formidable than anything they had faced before. But then, and this is the crucial moment, Caesar reminded his troops of something they had temporarily forgotten. They were Romans. Not just soldiers, not just legionnaires, but citizens of the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Heirs to a military tradition that stretched back centuries. Men whose ancestors had faced Hannibal, had conquered Macedonia, had brought order to the Mediterranean world through courage, discipline, and unbreakable determination. The speech Caesar gave that day has been lost to history, but its effects were immediately apparent. By the time he finished speaking, 40,000 Roman voices were raised in a battle cry that echoed off the walls of Gergovia itself. The legions were ready to fight again, but Caesar knew that morale alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the strategic challenges he faced. Vercingetorix had demonstrated tactical brilliance and had united Gallic resistance in ways that no previous leader had managed. A direct assault on Gergovia would likely result in another costly defeat, so Caesar decided to do something completely unexpected, something so audacious that even his closest subordinates questioned his sanity. He was going to abandon the siege of Gergovia entirely. Now you might be thinking, wasn't that exactly what Vercingetorix wanted? Hadn't the entire purpose of the Gallic strategy been to force Caesar into impossible situations where he would have no choice but to retreat? But here's the brilliant part of Caesar's plan. He wasn't retreating, he was repositioning. And he was doing it in a way that would force Vercingetorix to abandon his own strategic advantages and fight the kind of battle that favored Roman capabilities. The key was understanding something about Gallic political psychology that Vercingetorix couldn't afford to ignore. The rebellion's success depended entirely on maintaining the impression that Gallic forces were winning decisive victories against Roman power. If Caesar simply marched away from Gergovia without a major battle, Vercingetorix would look like a leader who had won a defensive victory but couldn't deliver the kind of crushing defeat that would drive Rome out of Gaul permanently. More importantly, Caesar was going to position his forces in a location where Gallic numerical advantages would matter less than Roman discipline and tactical sophistication. The target was Alesia. Now, this decision absolutely shocked everyone involved in the campaign, Roman and Gallic alike. Alesia was another hilltop fortress, even more formidable than Gergovia in many ways. Why would Caesar abandon one impossible siege only to begin another? The answer reveals the true depth of Caesar's strategic thinking. Alesia was located at the confluence of several major roads that controlled trade and communication across central Gaul. More importantly, it was positioned in terrain that would allow Caesar to use his engineering expertise to maximum advantage. Unlike Gergovia, which was built on a volcanic plateau that resisted Roman construction techniques, Alesia was surrounded by valleys and hills that could be turned into the foundation for the most sophisticated siege works ever attempted. Most crucially of all, Alesia's location meant that Vercingetorix couldn't simply wait behind his walls while Caesar's supply situation deteriorated. The fortress controlled territory that was essential to the Gallic war effort. If Caesar threatened Alesia, Vercingetorix would have to respond. And when he did, Caesar would be ready. The march from Gergovia to Alesia was unlike anything in Caesar's previous campaigns. Instead of the swift, aggressive advances that had characterized his earlier conquests, this was a careful, methodical withdrawal conducted under constant harassment by Gallic forces. Every day brought skirmishes as Gallic cavalry probed Roman defenses. Every night brought raids on Roman camps that kept the legions in a constant state of alert. It was the exhausting, nerve-wracking ordeal that tested Roman discipline and endurance to their limits. But it was also exactly what Caesar had planned. You see, each attack, each skirmish, each night raid was drawing Gallic forces further away from their prepared positions around Gergovia. Vercingetorix was being forced to fight the kind of mobile campaign that favored Roman tactical flexibility over Gallic numerical superiority. More importantly, The constant pressure was revealing details about Gallic organization, capabilities, and leadership that Caesar's intelligence network catalogued for future use. By the time the Roman column reached Alesia, Caesar knew exactly what kind of enemy he was facing, and he had a plan that would use that knowledge to devastating effect. But first, he had to survive what Vercingetorix was planning to do when the Gallic forces caught up with him. The final confrontation was coming, and both commanders knew that everything, their personal reputations, their political futures, the fate of Gaul itself, would be decided by what happened next. Caesar had one last throw of the dice, one final opportunity to demonstrate that Roman engineering and discipline could overcome any odds. If he failed, his career would be over and Gaul would be lost forever. If he succeeded, he would become the most famous general in human history. The stage was set for the Battle of Alesia, and the entire ancient world held its breath. In the silence that followed Caesar's withdrawal from Gergovia, something extraordinary rippled across the ancient world. For the first time in over a century, a Roman army had been forced into retreat by barbarian forces. Not destroyed, not annihilated, but definitively outmaneuvered by an enemy that Rome had consistently dismissed as inferior in every meaningful way. The psychological impact was staggering. In Rome itself, Caesar's political enemies could hardly contain their excitement. Here, finally, was proof that the great Julius Caesar was not invincible, that his legendary streak of victories had been based more on luck than genius, that the man they feared most could be brought down by his own hubris and ambition. Cicero, that master of political rhetoric, began crafting speeches that would demand Caesar's immediate recall from Gaul. Cato the Younger saw an opportunity to destroy his greatest rival once and for all. Even Pompey, Caesar's former ally, began making subtle inquiries about what military forces he could command if the situation in Gaul deteriorated further. But here's what none of them understood about the true significance of what had happened at Gergovia. Caesar hadn't just lost a battle. He had received an education in the realities of leadership that would reshape his entire approach to power, politics, and warfare. What Caesar couldn't have known was that his defeat at Gergovia was teaching him lessons that would prove invaluable during the civil wars that lay ahead. He was learning how to recover from setbacks, how to maintain loyalty among subordinates during crisis, and most importantly, how to turn apparent disasters into opportunities for even greater victories. The immediate consequences, however, were severe enough to threaten everything Caesar had built over 6 years of Gallic campaigning. Tribal delegations that had remained neutral throughout the earlier phases of the rebellion now openly declared for Vercingetorix. The Helvetii, the same tribe whose migration had originally drawn Caesar into Gaul, began massing forces along Roman supply routes. Germanic war bands crossed the Rhine in increasing numbers, drawn by promises of Roman plunder and Gallic gold. Most dangerously of all, the defeat at Gergovia had proven that Caesar's legions could be beaten. That changed the psychological dynamic of the entire conflict in ways that went far beyond simple military calculations. Gallic warriors who had spent years in fear of Roman retribution now saw their enemies as mortal men who could bleed, suffer, and die like anyone else. The mystique of invincibility that had been Rome's greatest weapon in subduing barbarian peoples was shattered, perhaps permanently. But Vercingetorix's greatest victory also contained the seeds of his ultimate defeat. You see, success created pressures that the Gallic leader couldn't entirely control. Tribal chieftains who had joined the rebellion expecting quick, decisive victories now demanded immediate action against Roman territories. Warriors who had proven they could defeat Caesar's legions in battle wanted to press their advantage before Roman reinforcements could arrive from across the Alps. The political dynamics of the rebellion were forcing Vercingetorix to fight the kind of campaign that favored Roman strengths over Gallic advantages. And Caesar, brilliant, adaptable Caesar, was already planning how to exploit exactly those pressures. Sound familiar? It should. The pattern of overconfidence following initial success. The pressure from political allies to take risks that military logic advised against. the gradual loss of strategic flexibility as tactical victories created new constraints. These are themes that echo through military history from ancient times to the present day. What happened at Gergovia wasn't just a defeat for Caesar. It was a masterclass in how intelligent, capable leaders can be undone by the very qualities that made them successful in the first place. Caesar's confidence in Roman superiority had blinded him to the real capabilities of his Gallic opponents. Vercingetorix's success in uniting the tribes would eventually force him into exactly the kind of decisive battle that his earlier strategy had been designed to avoid. Both men were victims of their own success, trapped by expectations and pressures that made rational strategic thinking increasingly difficult. The aftermath of Gergovia also revealed something fascinating about the nature of Roman military culture. Despite the defeat, despite the retreat, despite the obvious damage to Caesar's reputation, his legions remained fundamentally loyal to their commander. There were no mutinies, no demands for new leadership, no collapse of discipline that might have been expected after such a significant setback. Why? Because Caesar had spent 6 years demonstrating that he cared more about his soldiers' lives and welfare than he did about his own glory or reputation. When the situation at Gergovia became untenable, he had chosen strategic withdrawal over a suicidal assault that would have preserved his pride at the cost of thousands of Roman lives. That decision, painful as it must have been for a man of Caesar's ambition, earned him a loyalty that would prove unbreakable during the trials ahead. The march from Gergovia to Alesia became a legend in its own right. Roman historians would later describe it as one of the finest examples of tactical withdrawal in military history, a fighting retreat that maintained unit cohesion and morale despite constant harassment by superior enemy forces. But for the men who lived through it, the march was an ordeal that tested every aspect of Roman military training and discipline. Day after day of skirmishes, night after night of interrupted sleep, week after week of uncertainty about whether they would live to see Rome again. Yet they endured. They followed Caesar deeper into hostile territory, trusting that their commander had a plan that would justify the risks he was asking them to take. That trust would be vindicated at Alesia, where Caesar would orchestrate the most brilliant siege in ancient history and destroy Gallic resistance once and for all. But the seeds of that victory were planted in the ashes of defeat at Gergovia. Imagine if things had gone differently. What if Caesar had never been forced to retreat? What if his string of easy victories had continued unbroken? Would he have learned the lessons about resilience, adaptability, and the limits of military power that would serve him so well during the civil wars? Would the man who crossed the Rubicon have been the same Caesar who had never tasted defeat in Gaul? It's impossible to know, of course, but there's something compelling about the idea that Caesar's greatest defeat may have been the foundation for his ultimate transformation from successful general to master of the Roman world. The defeat at Gergovia taught Caesar that even the most brilliant strategies could be undone by overconfidence and inflexibility. That lesson would serve him well when he faced Pompey's legions at Dyrrhachium, where he would suffer another serious defeat, but recover to win decisive victory at Pharsalus. More importantly, the experience of leading demoralized troops through hostile territory, while maintaining their loyalty and fighting effectiveness, would prove invaluable during the civil wars, when Caesar would face enemies who understood Roman tactics as well as he did. In the end, Gergovia was the defeat that made Caesar's later victories possible. A harsh education in the realities of command that transformed a talented general into a legendary one. Looking back across the centuries, the Battle of Gergovia stands as one of those pivotal moments that reveal fundamental truths about leadership, strategy, and the unpredictable nature of human conflict. What makes this battle so fascinating isn't just that Caesar lost, though that in itself is remarkable enough. It's how that defeat revealed both the limitations and the ultimate resilience of one of history's most extraordinary military minds. Think about it. Here was a man who had spent 6 years systematically conquering the most warlike peoples in Europe, who had crossed rivers that previous Roman commanders considered impassable, stormed fortresses that had resisted siege for generations, and defeated armies that outnumbered his own forces by overwhelming margins. And yet, when faced with an opponent who had studied his methods and developed effective counters to Roman tactics, Caesar's legendary invincibility proved to be an illusion. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about Caesar's character. Instead of being broken by defeat, instead of making excuses or blaming subordinates, he analyzed what had gone wrong and used that knowledge to become an even more formidable commander. The Caesar who retreated from Gergovia was not the same man who would later design the siege works at Alesia. The experience of failure had taught him things about leadership and strategy that no amount of success could have provided. Modern connections to Caesar's experience at Gergovia are everywhere if you know how to look for them. How many successful business leaders have been undone by overconfidence? How many political careers have been destroyed by the inability to adapt to changing circumstances? How many military commanders throughout history have suffered defeat because they underestimated opponents who had studied their methods and developed effective countermeasures? The pattern is depressingly familiar. Success breeds confidence, confidence breeds predictability, and predictability creates vulnerabilities that intelligent opponents can exploit. What separates the truly great leaders from the merely successful ones is the ability to learn from failure without being crushed by it, to acknowledge mistakes without losing the confidence necessary to command others, to adapt strategies without abandoning core principles. Caesar demonstrated all of these qualities in the aftermath of Gergovia, which is why his defeat there became the foundation for even greater victories later. But let's also give credit where credit is due. Vercingetorix's victory at Gergovia was a masterpiece of strategic thinking that deserves recognition as one of the finest examples of asymmetric warfare in ancient history. Faced with an enemy that was superior in discipline, training, equipment, and logistical capabilities, the Gallic leader developed a strategy that turned every Roman advantage into a potential weakness. He understood that he didn't need to match Roman capabilities. He just needed to create conditions where those capabilities couldn't be effectively employed. The scorched earth tactics that denied Caesar's forces the ability to live off the land. The unified command structure that allowed coordinated resistance across hundreds of miles of territory. The psychological warfare that gradually eroded Roman confidence while building Gallic morale. These were innovations that wouldn't have been out of place in modern military doctrine. Vercingetorix was thinking and planning like a 20th century guerrilla leader, not a 1st century barbarian chieftain. His tragedy was that ultimate victory required him to abandon the very strategies that had made him successful. Political pressures within the Gallic coalition forced him to seek the kind of decisive battle that Caesar was better equipped to win. At Alesia, the roles would be reversed. Caesar would be the one employing patient, methodical tactics, while Vercingetorix would be forced into increasingly desperate attempts to achieve quick, dramatic results. The lessons from Gergovia echo through military history right up to the present day. During World War II, German forces that had seemed invincible during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns were gradually worn down by opponents who had learned to counter their tactics. The same technological and organizational advantages that had made German victories possible became liabilities when facing enemies who had studied their methods and developed effective responses. In Vietnam, American forces with overwhelming superiority in firepower and technology were ultimately defeated by an opponent that understood the political dimensions of the conflict better than the military ones. Like Caesar at Gergovia, American commanders found that their traditional advantages meant little against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. More recently, conventional military forces have struggled against insurgent opponents who employ tactics that were remarkably similar to Vercingetorix's strategy in Gaul. Asymmetric warfare, attacks on supply lines, the use of terrain and local knowledge to offset technological disadvantages. These are timeless principles that work as well today as they did 2,000 years ago. But perhaps the most important lesson from Gergovia isn't military at all. It's about the nature of leadership itself. Caesar's response to defeat, his willingness to acknowledge mistakes, adapt his strategies, and maintain the loyalty of his subordinates despite serious setbacks, provides a template for leadership that transcends any particular field or era. The ability to fail forward, to turn setbacks into learning opportunities, to maintain confidence while acknowledging limitations. These are qualities that separate truly exceptional leaders from those who simply happen to be successful under favorable circumstances. Caesar's defeat at Gergovia was the crucible that forged the man who would become master of the Roman world. Without that experience of failure, would he have possessed the resilience and adaptability necessary to survive the civil wars? Would he have understood the limits of military power that informed his later political strategies? We can't know for certain, but there's compelling evidence that Caesar's greatest defeat was also one of his most valuable experiences. The battle itself has been largely overshadowed in popular memory by Caesar's later victory at Alesia and his subsequent civil war campaigns. But military historians recognize Gergovia as a perfect case study in how intelligent, adaptive leadership can overcome even the most formidable challenges. For modern leaders facing their own impossible situations, Caesar's experience offers both warning and encouragement. Warning that success can create blind spots that make us vulnerable to failure. Encouragement that failure itself need not be the end of the story if we possess the courage and intelligence to learn from our mistakes. So I have to ask you, do you think Caesar's incredible resilience was born of iron discipline or pure dumb luck? Could any leader have recovered from such a devastating setback? Or was there something unique about Caesar's character that made his comeback possible? Which aspect of this story resonates most strongly with you? The brilliant tactical innovation of Vercingetorix, or the remarkable psychological resilience that Caesar demonstrated in defeat? And here's the question that keeps me awake at night. What lesson from Caesar's defeat at Gergovia feels most urgently relevant to our world today? In an era when leaders at every level face challenges that seem impossible to overcome, what can we learn from a Roman general's experience of failure and recovery 2,000 years ago? The answers to those questions might tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the ancient world. Because in the end, the story of Gergovia isn't really about Caesar or Vercingetorix or the Roman conquest of Gaul. It's about the eternal human struggle to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through courage, intelligence, and the refusal to accept defeat as final. And that's a story that will never grow old.